choosing the candidates, paying for the campaigns. It doesn't happen everywhere in the world. It really is. This is one of the only places in the world where it does happen. And
picture this, the soft glow of Laurel Canyon in the late 60s, where golden harmonies echoed off hillside homes, and the spirit of artistic freedom swirled in the California air. It was a place where legends were born, and among them stood Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, two legendary titans of song who seemed, from a distance, to be part of the same mystical circle. But behind the music, a storm was brewing. And now, decades later, Neil Young has finally broken the silence, revealing the cold, calculated revenge that Joni Mitchell once took on him, and unmasking the darker side of the woman the world once saw as the queen of poetic beauty. At first it was subtle. In the early days of their careers, Neil and Joni often found themselves orbiting the same stages, parties, and studio sessions. Both hailed from Canada, both were fiercely independent artists, and both had strong tempers masked behind soft-spoken lyrics. But Joni's need for control and sharp tongue often clashed with Neil's unpredictable nature and raw emotional intensity. While they shared mutual respect musically, there was tension simmering beneath the surface. Joni viewed Neil as reckless and impulsive. Neil, on the other hand, found Joni cold, calculating, and obsessed with image. The mutual admiration slowly gave way to distance, and then to something much colder. Neil's fans were shocked to hear the real story, one that was whispered in private circles but never brought to the surface. After a particularly bitter disagreement in the early 90s, sparked by a collaboration that went disastrously wrong, Joni began a quiet campaign to erase Neil from her artistic memory. Not with screams, not with public brawls, but with something far more unsettling: silence. She didn't confront him, she vanished him. One by one, she cut the threads that had connected their shared legacy. She publicly dismissed his music in interviews with clipped disapproval, painting his work as erratic and juvenile. When festival organizers suggested joint appearances, she refused. She declined tribute shows. She vetoed his name in roundtable events. At private industry parties, she would leave the room if he walked in, not with anger, but with the chill of a woman who had already buried a body. To outsiders it seemed puzzling, but to those close to both icons, it was a masterclass in calculated emotional warfare. Joni didn't rage, she erased. With every event she refused, every panel she declined, every passive-aggressive comment she let slip, she was writing Neil out of the narrative they once shared.
to do things, I can share a message, I can get awareness out there that these things exist and prove that they exist, win awards for it.
And the wound went deep. Neil, known for his gruff exterior and unpredictable temperament, was left stunned by the emotional exile. He had been caught off guard, ambushed by a quiet fury he didn't see coming. For years, he kept his confusion to himself, too proud to speak of the freeze-out that had left him artistically orphaned by someone he once called a peer. But it festered. And now, after decades of silence, Neil is done pretending it didn't hurt. In his eyes, Joni's revenge wasn't loud. It was glacial. And that's what made it unforgettable. Not a firestorm, but a slow freeze that left no ashes. Only ice. But Neil's revelations didn't stop there. He painted a portrait of Joni Mitchell that few had dared to. One of a woman whose romantic life was a battlefield of broken hearts and emotional manipulation. Think of the trail she left behind. Graham Nash, the man who adored her, was left shattered when she abruptly ended their engagement with a single note left on a table. Jackson Browne, another famed lover, found himself vilified in her songs and isolated from mutual friends after their split. But there were others too, lesser-known names with equally painful endings. Leonard Cohen, with whom she shared a brief but intense connection, walked away reportedly saying Joni wanted to love but not be loved back. James Taylor, during his darkest period of heroin addiction, found temporary solace in her arms, but she allegedly pushed him away when he became too dependent. Joni's pattern seemed clear. She was drawn to tortured men, but when their pain threatened to overshadow her own, she vanished. Her relationship with Warren Beatty was short-lived and filled with tension. She reportedly mocked him for being all charm, no soul, and ended things coldly. With Sam Shepard, the playwright and actor, things became even more complicated. Their emotional entanglement bled into both their works, but it was Joni's unwillingness to compromise or soften that finally drove them apart. For Joni, love was a mirror she held up to examine herself, and once the reflection no longer served her art, she turned away. Each romance left behind a man stunned, bruised, or bitter, and a song that would immortalize the pain. She was brilliant, yes, but her partners often said she was emotionally armored. In her music, she poured her soul out. In life, she often retreated behind a wall of intellect, wit, and brutal honesty. Vulnerability, when it came, was brief and dangerous. More than one lover left her life calling her a genius, but also impossible to love. And Neil, who had watched this pattern unfold over decades, could no longer keep the stories to himself. He saw the wreckage, the emotional carnage, and the brilliance all braided together. To him, Joni wasn't just a woman of artistic fire. She was also the cold wind that blew through many hearts, leaving behind echoes of what could have been. Joni's conflicts didn't end with her lovers. She had sharp-tongued disputes with several of her contemporaries, and didn't care who knew it. She clashed famously with Bob Dylan, calling him a fake and accusing him of stealing his entire persona. She once said he was nothing but a plagiarist in cowboy boots, and despite sharing stages in the past, she never missed an opportunity to undermine him in later interviews. The tension between them simmered for years, growing more poisonous with every passive-aggressive barb thrown from either side. She mocked Madonna, calling her a vulgar opportunist, and accused her of lowering the standards of art to appeal to commercial markets. Beyoncé was labeled a product, not a creator, while Lady Gaga was dismissed as a performance machine with no soul. These weren't just critiques, they were public lashings. Joni struck with precision and intent, often from behind the veil of self-righteous artistry. But her most bitter rivalry? That may have been with Joan Baez. Once allies in the folk movement, their friendship deteriorated rapidly during the early 1970s. Joni accused Baez of pandering to political sentiment rather than staying true to artistic purity. She believed Joan performed for causes, not from the soul. The final blow reportedly came during a backstage spat at a European festival, where the two exchanged heated words about authenticity, betrayal, and ambition. After that, they never shared a stage again. Joni's conflicts weren't limited to stars of her era either. In the 2000s, she had a very public falling out with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, calling the institution a boys' club circus, and refusing to attend induction ceremonies for years. She also severed ties with multiple collaborators over the decades, producers, photographers, even former friends, when she felt they no longer served her artistic vision. These weren't just words said in passing, they were knives, words intended to wound, delivered in public interviews, private parties, and press junkets. Each feud, each cold shoulder, each dramatic exit added to the growing portrait of an artist who burned nearly as many bridges as she built. For Joni, conflict wasn't an unfortunate consequence of fame. It was part of the architecture of her legend. Behind the glamour, Joni carried a lifelong wound, one that even her most poetic lyrics couldn't fully conceal. In 1965, before fame struck, she gave birth to a daughter and, unable to support her, gave the child up for adoption. It was a decision that haunted her every day of her life. Joni was barely out of art school when she made the heart-wrenching decision. Alone, penniless, and abandoned by the child's father, she spent the final months of her pregnancy hidden away in a boarding house in Toronto, where the shame of unwed motherhood was still a heavy burden in the eyes of society. Her guitar was her only companion, and even then, it couldn't drown out the guilt. When she handed over the baby, Kelly Dale Anderson, to a Canadian adoption agency, it was supposed to be a clean break, but it wasn't. The ghost of that choice followed her into every recording studio, onto every tour bus, and onto every stage. Songs like Little Green and River were not just haunting melodies, they were veiled cries of a mother still aching for the child she never got to hold. For years she kept the secret buried. Not even her closest collaborators, not David Crosby, not Graham Nash, knew about the daughter she had given away. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and in the late 90s, a media storm erupted when the press discovered the identity of her long-lost daughter. Their reunion in 1997 was front-page news, hailed by fans as a fairy tale ending. But inside the private world of Mitchell's reconnected family, the reality was far more complicated. Lauren Gibb, the daughter who had grown up without her famous mother, struggled with the overwhelming public attention and expectations. Joni, still guarded, found it difficult to bridge the decades-long emotional gap. Their relationship quickly unraveled. There were arguments, resentment, and long silences. Joni, used to artistic control, found it nearly impossible to navigate the raw, unpredictable emotions of a real-life daughter. Lauren, who had dreamed of a nurturing reunion, instead encountered the cold wall of a woman scarred by years of guilt and pain. In interviews, Joni began speaking less of healing and more of disillusionment. Privately, she returned to her solitude. Paintbrushes, cigarettes, and music her only companions. And Neil, he saw it all. He had been there, quietly observing, watching how Joni wore her past like armor, but never truly healed from it. The daughter she gave away was never truly gone. She had simply become another ghost in a life already haunted by too many. Now that Neil has spoken out, the myth of Joni Mitchell stands forever changed. No longer just the goddess of folk poetry or the untouchable muse of Laurel Canyon, she emerges as a flawed and complicated figure, as capable of cruelty as she was of beauty. Her life, riddled with betrayals, estrangements, and emotional warfare, reveals how genius often walks hand in hand with pain. But here's the twist. Even in her most ruthless moments, Joni Mitchell remained an artist who transformed scars into symphonies. She fought hard, loved harder, and burned with an intensity that both attracted and repelled. And in the end, her story isn't just one of conflict. It's a cautionary tale of what happens when brilliance is burdened by the weight of unresolved wounds. Neil Young's revelations may shock some, but to those who knew the real Joni, the one behind the poetry and praise, it's not a surprise. It's a reckoning. Her story is one of contrasts, where fragile beauty danced alongside razor-sharp bitterness, where the woman who wrote "Both Sides Now" could, in the same breath, alienate friends, wound lovers, and leave a wake of silence that echoed louder than any applause. Even her closest allies would eventually describe her as distant, unyielding, and shrouded in icy self-protection. Yet the genius of Joni Mitchell wasn't just in the chords she struck on her guitar or piano, it was in how she dared to live unapologetically, even if it meant making enemies, even if it meant being alone. Today, her legacy is no longer protected by poetic myth. It's real, raw, and riddled with contradictions. Her triumphs were brilliant, her downfalls brutal. And as Neil finally tears away the curtain, the world sees Joni not as a goddess, but as a woman, scarred, complicated, and unforgettable.